Tom Maguire of Brightspeed, welcome. It's great to be able to talk to you today.
It's great to be here, Jonathan. Thank you very much for the invitation.
The dominant conduit for telecommunications back then was copper. But
Hmm.
here we are in 2025, and our networks still have almost mandatory copper uh, infrastructure still out there.
Yep.
Why is that a problem to a layperson who doesn't know the difference between different kinds of technology solutions? Why do we still have copper out there being used? And what do you say to folks who say, well, what's wrong with copper? Why don't we just keep it?
So while copper was a great technology when things first started, it's a great way to conduct electrical signals. It can't keep up from a technical perspective with the demands of customers today. I'll use a stupid analogy. At one point in time, we used to use horses to get around, and now obviously we're using, EVs. We're using gas-powered vehicles. Can you imagine if we kept all the horses around on a highway and we had horses and cars and EVs moving on the same path to try to get people from point A to point B? Not very efficient, not very safe, not very practical. Copper technology is the horse of yesteryear. While it's nice to have horses around in some places, that's all well and good. But to rely on them for our daily transportation needs, it's highly impractical, and I feel the same way with copper. I grew up with copper. Um, at one point in time, I guess I'm one of the original Nepo babies because my father worked for the company at one point, and he grew up in copper. I was showing somebody a picture the other day. He was using he started as a lineman before I was born, and he was using a lashing machine. And I said, "Well, we're still using those same lashing machines, but the infrastructure that he was deploying, it's just that stuff is still hanging around out there. I know in New York there are cables that are decades old, and these things take their toll through through nobody's fault. You have the phenomenon like electrolysis, you have steam issues, you have now we see a lot of instances where people are actually stealing copper cable because of the value of copper. Not and the ironic thing is they're stealing copper cable to sell copper to people to make devices that rely on fiber to function properly. And so it doesn't make sense for us to continue to rely on copper infrastructure if we have something better that's out there. And I think that the best product we have is fiber. Still have, as an industry, a significant amount of copper that's out there, and to support that copper isn't getting any less expensive. And if you think of the money that we're wasting to support a technology that's woefully inadequate and is fragile in the face of environmental issues, then it's extremely wasteful. And I think as an industry, we need to continue to make the advances that Jonathan, you and the rest of US Telecom have been significant partners and have helped us make great strides. We just need to continue to push that even faster.
For the average for the average listener out there, Tom, why is it? Can you explain why it is that companies like Brightspeed, some of the others that you've mentioned, still have to double invest in maintaining these old copper networks? Why don't you just roll them up and get rid of them? What's holding you back?
We in certain states we have regulatory obligations, things known as carrier of last resort or COLR obligations, and those we're forced to keep that certain technology alive to because some of the newer technologies have not yet met whatever state standard there is in terms of replacing um, voice services, for example. So there are some states that are out there that are a lot more forward thinking and have allowed us to do that, but there are a significant number of states that you still need to maintain that carrier obligation that's out there, and which harkens back, I think, to the 1930s. With the creation of the FCC and and I think it's a Kingsbury Doctrine or agreement or something that stipulated that you had to give equal access to everybody. But a lot of this stuff, is literally, almost 100 years old in terms of regulation. And unfortunately, the regulations are kind of crafted around an antiquated copper infrastructure. And so I know that there's work taking place in DC in terms of what, Chairman Carr and his team, what are some of the acceptable ways to deliver those necessary services. And until we get all the states to adopt that same sort of mindset, we're still going to be unfortunately anchored by copper in some areas.
There still is a lot of work to do in the States, is that right?
Yes. Some of the states, I think some of the states have been very forward thinking. And when we first started doing network transformation work, going back, 2011 timeframe, there were states like Texas and Florida that were very good to work with. North Carolina has been a state that's the biggest state that Brightspeed has today that have been very good to work with. But there are some other states who shall remain nameless, but they know who they are, who they seem to relish pushing back against advances in telecom, and I just cannot figure out why. I've kind of butted heads with some of these states, and these are not necessarily in Brightspeed footprint. I'm thinking back to my last company that I worked for, and I just shake my head because I think these states are actually hurting their citizenry, if you will, as opposed to trying to help them. I've talked to some people that it's like, they're fighting a battle that's been long gone. I kind of marvel at these things. The technological advances that we've seen in the industry over the course of the last decade or so kind of negate the need for dial tone. One of the things that I do when I go in and I talk to some of the state regulators, one of the first questions I ask are how many people still have a phone in their house? And what I think is kind of ironic, the people who are pushing back, requiring us to maintain copper, they themselves don't have copper telephone service in their homes. So I shake my head and wonder what is it that they're trying to accomplish? What are they pushing back on? And I think those states need to start thinking about what's best for their the public that lives in those particular states, as opposed to just standing behind a regulation that's been around for 80, 90 years. That is kind of insignificant at this point in time.
Well said. So one of the solutions that Brightspeed has bet its future on is fiber technology. You've said publicly that um, Brightspeed's footprint is split into three territories: fiber now, fiber future, and fiber forward. Can you explain to the folks who might not be up to speed on what are these different technologies? Why is fiber your preferred technology over all of the other technologies that are out there?
The there's been a lot of discussion in public about some of the other stuff that's out there, and I think like any good toolbox, it's always good to have tools that are going to help you accomplish what it is that you want to accomplish. I think fiber is the best of the bunch, and the reason for that is a connection into somebody's house where right now I have fiber into this house and I'm using Wi-Fi mesh network in the house to stay connected. But to bring fiber into this house, I can have, I love gadgets. I think I have 56 different things that are hanging off of this network. Um, I can control the temperature in the house. I can control the lighting in the house. Security, I can control security. I have cameras in the house. And I do that. So when I'm not here, I know that the place is safe. I know that my wife is safe and I know that she's comfortable. Um, the other day we were out driving around and I happen to have a car that has satellite radio in it, and it kept cutting in and out. And my wife's like, "What's wrong with the radio?" And I said, "It's nothing wrong with the radio. It's the nature of the service." And it was a leaf fade situation. And so, some of the other technologies are good out there, but the thing is, you know, they're not perfect. They're not as reliable. They're not as I think consistent in terms of delivery as fiber is. You do run into situations like where where service cuts in and out. I was a satellite TV customer for the longest time, and when it snowed or when it rained, you ran into some problems. I remember one of the satellite providers a couple of years ago had an issue where in the winter months, cats were sleeping on their satellite dishes, their ground dishes, because there was a warm place to hang out. And it's kind of tough to get broadband signal through a bunch of cats piled up on top of each other. So to me, having that dedicated fiber into your household gives you the ability that is, it's limitless. You think about the advances that we've seen in fiber over the course of the years. We started out with BPON architecture, and now we're running. Brightspeed has an XGS PON, or a 10 gig symmetrical PON system that's out there. And the other day we were talking about, and this isn't for a residential use, but we were running 50 gig over fiber. We partnered with Calix in that trial, and others are doing similar things. I mean, you could routinely see 7, 8 multi-gig services being available to people's houses. The other technologies don't allow us to do that sort of thing, and so that's why I think that fiber is it's just the best technology you can get.
Sure. And one of the things about Brightspeed is that you are deploying fiber technology into multiple states, and many of the places you're deploying that technology are very, very rural. Our
Yes.
policymakers at state level and at Washington are really trying to sort out, well, how do we best serve, especially those rural communities that are unserved or underserved? For those communities, why is fiber the choice that they should be making over some of those other technologies? What does it mean for their economic development, for their ability to participate in the modern economy?
Yep. So when we first started thinking about Brightspeed and building out a fiber infrastructure, we actually partnered with Calix and with Corning. And I had a couple of years experience. I had two people that helped me launch Brightspeed, and they were Bob Mudge and Chris Krieger. And the three of us had a lot of experience at Verizon, building out wireline networks. So we all started in the copper world, and we were very involved in the FiOS rollout. And so when we first started thinking about Brightspeed, we knew it was very rural, the Brightspeed footprint. And so we set out to figure out a more efficient way to deploy a fiber infrastructure. And that's where Corning and Calix came into play. We talked to all the major providers. We just didn't come out and say, hey, we're going to pick you. We talked to everybody to figure out what was the best way to kind of stitch things together. And so we came out with a way where, I'm not faulting anybody, but early fiber networks were built off of the way the copper networks were designed. And we decided to do things a little bit differently. So we actually have a fiber nailed up to every household in our fiber footprint. And other people are still using distribution hubs. We've eliminated fiber distribution hubs altogether, and we're using a particular network design that allows us to bring fiber out to each and every one of the households that are out there. That helps keep costs down. And so right now, we have probably 2.3, 2.4 million households that we've built out in the last 30 odd months with fiber. You mentioned our fiber footprint. We have those I consider to be fiber now because they have fiber now. We have fiber future, which are the remaining households that we intend to build fiber out. And then, unfortunately, we have fiber never properties. And some of those fiber never properties are like really, really isolated properties where it's going to cost a significant amount of money to build fiber out there. And so our plan now is to leverage, maybe there are other technologies, and we've been working with other companies in that regard, to try to see what we could do. You're talking about extremely remote places. I've had conversations with customers, and they said, well, can you get out to my house that's on the top of the mountain, on the other side of the river, past the gorge? And I said, well, listen, we have a very simple way of looking at things. If I could go down to the end of the block and I can hit 100 homes by making a left and spending X amount of dollars, or I could hit 2 homes by making a right and spending the same amount of money. Those 2 homes are not going to get fiber today. And so where we can get the most for the biggest bang for our buck, we're going to deploy fiber. But in some of those like super remote areas, I think it's best to leverage another technology out there to figure out how to serve those customers.
You and I were just talking a couple of days ago about when we're thinking about all of the new players that are entering the telecom space, we need to think and act differently as an industry. And that includes exactly what you're talking about, the need to work collaboratively and to secure partnerships where needed with adjacent industries, with other types of solution providers, with organizations like my own. Can you get into that a little bit more?
I don't, I when I started in the business, you got your telecom service from the telephone company. I started out with New York Telephone Company. And eventually you wound up with your video services from your cable company. So it was kind of that was a peaceful coexistence where you video from cable, dial tone from telecom. And going back about 25 years or so ago, it was kind of interesting when we started unbundling the network, and you had a lot of CLECs that were coming into town, competitive local exchange carriers. Then you had the incumbent local exchange carriers. But I think it was in the mid 2000s where all of a sudden the cable companies just figured out that they could get into the dial tone business and long distance business. And so, but you still had kind of that, a duopoly of sorts in a particular marketplace where, and this was as recent as maybe I'll say 5, 7 years ago, where if you wanted wireline services in your house, you had two choices. And during along the line, along my career path, they introduced wireless services, cellular services. So people started getting a handheld device, but that was kind of in addition to whatever they had in their home. And then we had the phenomenon at one point where wireless services actually went into the home. We did some of that at Verizon, where we in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, going back in 2012, where we started deploying a wireless device that allowed people to make phone calls, and it served 911 purposes, all that other sort of stuff. Um, and now, now you have low Earth orbit satellites coming into play. You have fixed wireless, which I think is different from a mobile device. And so now customers have multiple choices. And back in the duopoly days, you either won or you lost. And but it was like that peaceful coexistence that I described early on. But nowadays you can have multiple players in a particular market. And just getting back to the whole financial piece of it, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to say, okay, now my success is going to be based on whether I win that customer or I don't win that customer, because it isn't a 50-50 shot of getting that customer like it was in the good old days. Now you could have, like, 20% chance of getting that customer. So I think we need to think about things differently. I know John Harabin was talking about MVNOs and some of the partnerships that he saw when he was, I can't remember, he was talking about Frontier or Kinetic. We've looked at some of those things with Brightspeed, but we've had multiple conversations with a bunch of players to figure out, okay, how do we work together to, ultimately deliver the best service to the customers, but also improve our ability to succeed from a business perspective. So we've talked to the LEOs, we've talked to the FWA providers. One of the benefits of being around the industry for so long, I get to know a lot of people that do different things. And, we've had some pretty interesting conversations where, people didn't think about, they were focused on doing one particular thing. And we went in and said, okay, but what about this and that? We could partner and do this. And it's kind of, I think it's changed things a little bit. And I think as an industry, we need to consider some of those relationships, because if we go back to the fiber never territories, right now I have copper customers that are in there, and either I wind up spending a lot of money on maintaining those, or I come up with a partnership that allows me to deliver those customers the service that they want at a cost to provide service that's a lot less than running new cable in case somebody decides to
Right.
steal the cable. So I think those partnerships, maybe I learned this. I ran wholesale operations for Verizon for about a decade or so. And I realized that, in some respects, wholesale was better than no sale. And, that kind of changed my mindset a little bit. And, today I think we need to think a little bit broader, where it can't just be an us or them sort of equation. It's like got to be a we sort of thing. We got to figure that out there a little bit more.
And on the other side of the balance sheet measure are some of the costs that are associated with doing business in the in the modern telecom space. And one of those costs is making sure that you can adequately and effectively make sure that you have proper advocacy to navigate through some of these issues and encumbrances and barriers to deployment that you've mentioned. Uh, Brightspeed has made clear its commitment to partnerships to organizations like US Telecom and others. Why are those important?
I don't, it's there's an old saying, many hands make for light lifting. Um, and we Brightspeed's not a big company, right? Coming from Verizon, Brightspeed is a relatively small company. I think we were the fifth largest ILEC, depending on who's merging with who or what sort of sales are going through. We may be fourth or fifth once you figure out what's happening with Frontier and Verizon. Um, we our specialty is building networks and delivering service. And we do have, I think, a very strong regulatory arm, but it's small. And in the sense of many hands might make for light lifting, partnering with other folks like the other big carriers and having US Telecom and yourself as an advocate in DC for us is exceptional because we can't be there every day. You guys are in that battle every single day. And so, you're kind of the face of the industry, where we can't be that, right? Because we're busy focused on what's happening with our customers, even though we do have a regulatory arm as well. But I think having the group, everybody together, so we could go in there and have discussions and explain things to people. Once we can do a pretty good job of explaining why we're doing what we're doing or how we're doing what we're doing. But we need to have a seat at that table in order to be able to have, make that explanation. And I can't just like decide to drop into DC and call up Chairman Carr's office and say, "Hey, I'm in town. Do you mind if I stop by and explain what I'm doing?" I need to somebody who kind of helps establish that relationship. I think all of the carriers there's a lot of small carriers that are out there. And I think that US Telecom in particular, not blowing smoke, I think you guys do an exceptional job with that. And you kind of help, you are the proverbial foot in the door, and it's like once we get that foot in the door and we could get into that room, well, we could sit there and talk until the cows come home about why we think that our particular way of doing things is the best. But absent that foot, we're kind of yelling into the wind. So and I just it gets back to having a louder voice these days is a better thing from a business perspective. And you guys are like, you are that loud voice for us.
Well, I really appreciate that, Tom, and I promise as well not to try to put that foot in my mouth more often than I need to. So
That's my goal every day. I am not all that successful.
you're kind. Listen, thank you so much, Tom Maguire of Brightspeed, a legend in our industry, and we're really grateful to be able to have this
A
time to
legend.
visit. Yeah.
I don't know about the legend part, but I thank you very much.
Okay.